Alright, so we're back with a design discussion. Today we're taking a look at designing narrative choices, adding branches path to game stories without a AAA budget. Alright, seems interesting. It seems more of a, in terms of the title, obviously it's probably not going to be, but it looks more as a tutorial than anything. But we'll see what he has to say about it.
Big budget games are getting harder to make. Cutting edge AAA games get more expansive, more fluidly animated, and more beautiful every year. That means more assets need to be made, more detail needs to go into each piece, more polish needs to be applied. All of this needs to be done by the professional artists, animators, riggers, musicians, and programmers of the gaming industry. And they don't work for free. But even with the astronomical budgets of modern AAA games, there's an ironic twist. There are game design problems that get harder and harder to solve as a game scales up. The more work that goes into making a game, the harder it is to infuse it with meaningful narrative choice. The ability to play with narrative choice is one of the great strengths of video games as an art medium. But narrative choice needs to be thought through carefully, and all paths of that choice need to be developed. Otherwise, if you're not careful, if a game designer or scriptwriter could put narrative choice in wherever they think it's most interesting, the production process of a game can get out of hand very quickly. So what are some ways that game developers add meaningful narrative choice efficiently?
And well, I mean, this is basically sums up the reason why pretty much no game nowadays makes actual fully branched stories, in the sense that in most games, whenever there is like an actual branching story, it usually simply changes the ending of the game. And in that case, you might have this different cinematics for the ending, but that's pretty much about it, right? And it's very rare to have games that actually have big differences in depending on which branch you go towards. And it's very, very rare. And it's funny, he shows examples of The Walking Dead, like the Telltale series. And that is something that I always talk with friends, because I find it quite funny. He might mention it, but I guess I'll mention it now. Which is, you always, like, as soon as you realize this, you'll never miss it whenever you play a Telltale game. But whenever there is a very hard choice, that basically means, at least in the Walking Dead series, that basically means you either save one person or save another. You can only save one, and you have the choice to save one or the other. That always means that the one you actually saved is gonna die in the very near future. And basically, if you look at cinematics of people playing with the other character instead, you'll see that they basically take the place of the other character. So regardless of who you save, they basically play the same character, and maybe the dialogue will be slightly different. But it means, like I said, like if you say you have played like a character A, a character B. If you save character A, that means character B is gonna die in the near future. And that happens all the time in The Walking Dead, and I find it extremely funny. And it's understandable, right? Because you cannot follow a story and make two different stories with two different casts of characters because of who you saved and who you didn't. So you have to make ways to go back to like a linear, to like a normal thing. And that's why whenever you call branching stories nowadays are mostly, you have a little branch that usually comes back to a same like line of story. And it's mostly because otherwise you would have to be making two separate games for each branch, and it would be impossible. Anyways, let's see what he says.
Let's say we're making an RPG that follows the plot of Star Wars Episode 4. Early on, you want to let the player make a really interesting narrative choice for Luke. He could follow Ben, become a Jedi, and save the galaxy. Or he could stay as a moisture farmer on Tatooine. If you leave with Ben, your game should probably develop into a pretty standard RPG. Action sequences, dialogue options, pretty similar to Knights of the Old Republic. But if you stay, it wouldn't really make sense to have a bunch of fight scenes. Instead, the Luke as moisture farmer game might feel a bit more like a Star Wars themed Harvest Moon. A completely different experience. The setting would be unique, game mechanics would be completely different, The music would change. Entirely different creatures and people would have to be modeled. If you had a big set-piece action sequence on the Galaxy Saving branch, you'd probably want to create something equally impressive on the other side, or else the branches would feel out of balance.
And obviously this seems like a very weird example, a very like extreme example, because obviously in this case it would basically be two different, completely different games. And as a player, that would be kind of weird, because if you're looking to play a Star Wars game, an action Star Wars game, you're kind of forced to pick a specific branch, right? Which is a little bit weird. Obviously, that didn't happen. And I think he's basically illustrating, he's going a little bit too deep in this thing, basically. But he's basically illustrating the fact that you can't allow players to choose at every moment of the story, right? There's only certain pieces that might help, or that might allow, or you might allow actual choices.
You'd need way more people and way more time to build out both choices. By giving the player just this one narrative choice, the studio would need to create two essentially unique games and bundle them into one disc. But this example is a bit overboard.
Yeah.
If it were that hard to add narrative choice, we wouldn't have many games with it at all. So, how do...
But again, he's like showing here the Telltale series of The Walking Dead, but they pretty much, in most situations, most quote-unquote choices, they basically always end up coming back to the same narrative.
Game designers add what feels like meaningful narrative choice to their games without creating an avalanche of work. Well, for one, you can make the choices not last nearly as long. If you can make a choice, but resolve that choice before too long, you can rejoin a central plot thread.
Basically, that's what Walking Dead does. If you save character A instead of character B, if character A is the top and character B is the thing, then it doesn't matter because the other character is going to die, therefore you go back to the same
For
narration
example,
anyways.
Night in the Woods lets you pick which friend to hang out with on several nights. Hanging out lets you get more insight on each of the characters, but the next morning will play out the same way no matter what choice you make.
Of course, these choices are nice because they basically, they don't actually change the narrative whatsoever. The story of the game is the same, the gameplay of the game is the exact same. It's basically allowing you to choose it's kind of like if you would allow the player to sit down at home and watch a film, and you have the choice of which film you watch. It's not going to change the story of the game, but you have this little cinematic that you can watch, and you're going to watch one or the other. It doesn't actually change anything.
The choices
So personally, I wouldn't necessarily call this a branching story whatsoever.
are isolated, and this can encourage multiple playthroughs, but using this technique can cause other problems too. Shadow the Hedgehog has a bunch of splitting paths that unlock as you make choices during the earlier stages.
Personally, I think that this system is very clever, although I don't know if he's going to mention it, but I've actually played this game. But what ends up happening is that the main, quote-unquote, main story, or the main, or quote-unquote, finishing a run, or however you want to call it, is actually quite short.
Letting you sort of plinko your way through to the end of the game.
But they also make it very visual, as in you know exactly what you're going through. And one of the issues of this game, which I'm sure he's going to mention, is that you play the first level hundreds of times.
It even diagrams all the paths that you've taken.
Exactly.
So you can see exactly where you are. Unfortunately, once you've played through the game a few times, you have to slog through big chunks of the story that you've already played to get to any new content.
That is quite true, yes.
Also, Shadow the Hedgehog is terrible, and it's really hard to make a bad game good by having a lot of different endings.
It's not that bad. Honestly, I don't think it's that bad of a game, though. And I do think it's a clever idea, especially the fact that they actually make it in your face, as in that's how you're progressing, and this is the things you're unlocking. And then when you start again, it says, well, you've unlocked these levels, but you haven't unlocked these other levels, so you have to play this way in order to get these levels. I actually think it's quite nice. It does have some issues. It would be nice if in some scenarios, if, for example, after the first level, you basically have 3 choices. So it would be nice, for example, that if you've already unlocked those 3 choices, that you could choose to start at the point where you haven't unlocked, for example. But yeah.
Speaking of that, another way to get the feeling of choice in a game without blowing your budget is by having multiple endings. If the ending hinges on one choice, especially near the end, you don't have to make as much content for each path.
And that's basically what most games do. That's what I said at the beginning. This is what most
And
games
you
do.
also avoid that replay fatigue problem if you let the players save right before they make that choice.
But then it's also what many people complain about. So, you know.
You can also make a lot of small choices add up, instead of having a single major choice decide your ending. A lot of BioWare games took this route, with a light and dark meter in Knights of the Old Republic and the Paragon Renegade system in Mass Effect. Throughout the game, you accrue points that determine character alignment. Meet certain thresholds throughout the story, and new options open up to you, including distinct endings.
Fable, I think, does something
Fable and
similar as well.
Infamous did something similar too.
Exactly.
Dishonored has a more modern take on this. There's an order and chaos meter that you affect throughout the game. The world changes as you move towards either extreme.
For example, Dishonored, the story doesn't change, but the environment changes. And I think that is actually very nice as well. But it's different. It's quite different. But I really like it. I mean, I think
Which
it's an
helps
amazing
make the
system.
world feel impacted by small choices that you've made. However, these meter systems often have a problem. It's very easy to make the middle path uninteresting. If you don't act like the saintliest saint or the most devilish devil, your in-game options are limited. A lot of the most interesting powers are locked away at the extremes, and a lot of the more interesting story options are too. The middle path can result in underpowered characters, no faction to really call your own, and NPCs that criticize you for the choices you've made anyway.
Like, personally, the way that I would design it is I would try to make the middle path the most interesting one. And also, because usually in games like this, whenever there's multiple endings and so on, and if there's a continuation, like a second game or whatever, the developers end up selecting one of the endings as the real ending, in a way. So personally, because most players, if you just play normally and just make choices as you feel like it, you'll most likely end up in the middle. In that case, what I would do is always make the middle the quote-unquote most interesting, and make that obviously the real ending. And then what you could do is just add some funny flares and funny things to the extremes. Because obviously, if you want to play like an all crazy guy, then maybe you can have some interesting options or some interesting things. But they're not going to be, extremely strong or whatever.
This makes players want to pick a side and stick with it always, which ironically makes a game full of choices feel a lot more linear.
Totally, yeah.
Telltale adventure games have lots of small decision points too, but they often run into a different problem. If you make a choice between option A or option B, and both have to make sense in the rest of the plot, the game shouldn't just hand-wave away the implications of one of the paths. Take Telltale's Game of Thrones. In it, you have to pick one of your advisors to become your right-hand man. Spoiler alert, the other one betrays you.
Yeah, and indefinitely which one you choose, the other one will betray you. You know what I mean? It doesn't change. Like, it's the same character. As soon as you choose one of those paths, the other one, they both became the same character independently of who you chose.
Advisors. The reasons for their betrayal make sense. But if you choose to promote them instead, the other side completely breaks character to betray you. Just because both of these possibilities needed to rejoin the plot at the same point.
And this is what I said, Telltale does that all the time. Which I understand why they do it, because of course, if you look at The Walking Dead, you have, I don't know how many games now, 4 games in total, I think, which is always the continuation of the story. Like, if you actually make them fully branching, you can't do that, right? You would have to make 2 second games, depending on which side you took or which branch you took. It wouldn't make sense.
Another strategy that adds choice while keeping production costs down is to reuse as much of the game as possible, but give new context depending on the path you're taking. Tactics Ogre does an amazing job here. The game takes place on a small number of discrete maps which you travel through and fight on throughout the story. There are a few points in the main plot where you will pick a side to ally with, which completely changes which NPCs you encounter, fight for, and against. But the maps all remain the same. You might be fighting north to south for one faction, marching towards a southern port town, while if you took the other path, you'd be fighting on the same map, marching south to north, looking to besiege a northern castle. You get a completely different story and really feel like you've made a major choice without a ton of extra work for the developers.
But this is a little bit like the same way that Skyrim does which of the factions you choose. In the sense that you end up having kind of similar missions independently. But yeah, but it does give you like a meaningful
Chrono Cross
choice.
also reuses large parts of the game, but adds a lot of narrative choice through the interactions you have with your party members. The game lets you recruit literally dozens of unique characters, but many of them are blocked off in side quests or story options. Make a choice to save a character, and not only can they join your party, but entirely unrelated branches of the story will unlock later on, each in turn having their own characters to recruit. Make a different choice, and the game unfolds completely differently. The characters you recruit will all say the same lines in a given cutscene, but they'll say them according to their own verbal tics and mannerisms. Different events will happen in the same map location depending on which characters you've recruited before. Chrono Cross does have paper-thin characterization for most of the extended cast, especially once they join your party, but the game gives you so many options, and the same story advances in so many different ways depending on the path you take, that your choices do feel impactful. Lots of these techniques work best in relatively large games, but how do smaller indie studios with tiny staffs and shoestring budgets make games with interesting choice? Actually, that irony I talked about earlier works in their favor. The production value expectations that get baked into AAA game development make it more time-consuming to create the branching paths that come with meaningful choice. But if you don't have to make something as pretty as a AAA game, a lot of that problem goes away. Less graphical fidelity for each asset makes it easier for a small team to make more of them. It's much faster to make branching storylines for a game that looks like Final Fantasy Tactics than for a game that looks like Final Fantasy 15. Better development tools over the last 10 years have also made it easier to do more work in less time. Narrative choice is a tricky problem in game development.
Definitely.
If you let it, it can explode the scope of a project and slow down production on even the highest budget games. Finding the right combination of meaningful choice and handling how that choice plays out over the course of a game can mean the difference between an immersive and personally meaningful experience and vaporware.
Very well. I mean, what he ended up saying is mostly, like, it's explaining how other games do it. More than, it's not a tutorial, that's what I mean. But, yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with what he said, in the sense that, if you remove graphics or reduce the graphic fidelity, then obviously it takes less time. But, yeah, obviously it takes less time. But that doesn't mean, if you take the example that he took at the beginning with the Star Wars game, right? Even if you make it into a 2D, extremely basic sprites, right? It would still make you still have to make 2 games, right? And sure, each of those games would take you less if you do them like that than if you do them, with AAA graphics. But it's still 2 games. And one of the reasons that developers usually go for low fidelity is mostly due to time requirements and money. It's not necessarily because they want to make more branching stories, you know what I mean? So it is an issue. An issue, the issue with branching stories and trying to make branching storylines is mostly that, yes, if you actually want to make extremely meaningful stories, that means that each of those branches, of those choices, is going to increase your development time. Because you're going to have to make different cinematics depending on which side you're going to. and stuff like that, which is just gonna make it longer. Which is mostly the reason why most games don't feel like they have very meaningful choices. Because at the end of the day, they don't, because they can't. Otherwise, the game would take a lot longer to make. And it is also, as a developer, it's difficult to justify spending a lot of the time, because obviously if we're talking about one branch that just goes, separate into two, that's fine, because you only have to do 2 types of content. But even then, if a player just takes the bottom path, they're not going to see the top path unless they play the game again, right? So how worth it is it really to spend that much time on making multiple things if the players are only going to see one of them, right? So obviously, if you take that to the extreme and suddenly you don't only separate it by 1, but each of those also separate again by 2, that means that you're only going to see one path, and there's so many more development time that has been synced into all of these other paths that you're not going to see if you only play the game once, right? So again, only unless your game is being made to be played multiple times, it's difficult to justify that extra amount of time, right? And whenever, and that also makes a lot of other questions, right? When people are starting to actually start reviewing your game, it would be very interesting to know, okay, but which path did you take, right? And is there a path that is actually makes the game a lot better? Is there a path, would you have to start actually rating the different paths of the games? This path actually is just a 6 out of 10, but if you go through this path, so at least an 8 out of 10, right? So obviously it is, it really, makes you think about a lot of things, but I mean, it boils down to simply, if you make actual big branching things, it just increases development, and most of the time you just can't afford it. That's just basically the gist of it, which is why most games, even if they just end up doing well, just the final cinematic is different. That's it. Which is the easy solution, I guess, to make at least one meaningful choice at some point. And that's something that, for example, a lot of people complain about Cyberpunk, which is at the end of the day, the meaningful choice is just at the end. But anyways, yeah, that was it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time, I guess. Bye-bye.